Welcome to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DBS Group Research. I'm Temur Beg, Chief Economist, welcoming you to our 140th episode. Today's podcast is on the U.S. elections. During our annual Outlook event held on November the 8th, I discussed the implications of Donald Trump and the Republican Party's emphatic victory in the U.S. elections with Angela Mancini, partner at Control Risks. Link to our publication is in the show notes. Here is the recording.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning, and it's been quite the week, Angela.
It's been a busy, but something happened this week. Yes,
something happened.
Something happened.
So let's start by looking back. We had all these polls which suggested it was a neck-and-neck race. It wasn't at the end. Explain.
Yeah, so there's a couple of takeaways that we have here. And first of all, I have to say, so I work for Control Risk. We do political and regulatory risk consulting. We also have a security practice. That practice was quite worried about unrest around the election. We heard a lot of issues around not just if it were to be a close contested race, but even in the mornings as the polls were opening, were we going to see voter intimidation? Who was going to come out to help watch the election, et cetera? Very few things happened. So that's a good thing. So my main takeaway is for the optimists in the group would definitely be the system worked, very quiet election. In fact, some of the news coverage that I was doing was cut back because there just wasn't that much to say. That's a good thing, right? System worked. So the other thing I'd say, what didn't work is the polls, right? So there was an infinite amount of data in the weeks and days leading up of slicing all kinds of voter groups, right? From obviously gender, education, class, race, also who moved from blue states to red states with COVID, what's happening with inflation, the impact of AI on the professional class, all of it. And at the end of the day, it didn't really matter. What we saw, as you've seen, is the electorate shifted. It shifted rightward. So there wasn't, there's not a lot of parsing left to do. I think if you're aware of the name Alan Lichtman, he's a famous historian, and he's called 9 out of 10, now 9 out of the last 11 presidential races correctly. And he's got these 13 keys that he looks at. They didn't work. He was quite confident in B. Harris. His takeaway, as I was mentioning, was, at some point, the math doesn't math anymore. And what I take from that is the electorate shifted, the zeitgeist has shifted. The main issues we saw voters coming out with exit polls was clearly the economy, inflation, and that's something people feel every day. Even though the rate of inflation has slowed down, the cost of living stays high. So when you go to the grocery store every other day, when you go to the gas station every other day, you see that. So that's another issue, one thing to say. The other thing I'd point out that I haven't seen a lot of press on is job security increasingly in the professional class. So I know people, lawyers, accountants, bankers, what have you, maybe not bankers, but working in the marketing people, that they're starting to have job loss. There's layoffs that are still going on in the corporate world, and the impact of AI on that professional class, especially those in their 40s and 50s in the States, is concerning. So I think there's a couple of trends there. The last thing I'd say on the trends is a lot of people said they're worried about democracy, but I think the mainstream media got confused of what that meant, because people can mean different things by that, right? So a Democrat voter would say rule of law, policy, basically, right? What it means for, women and minorities and things. But Republican voters, I think, felt like freedom to be free in their view, to go back to the way things were, to not have the government telling me what to do and all the kind of culture war issues. So when some I'd say, a big message. I think the Democratic Party has a lot to think about. I think the Republican Party has also got a lot to think about, because that'll shift as well.
Did the external issues, relationship with Russia or the war in Gaza, did those things have much of an impact?
There's some impact, I'd say. First of all, China, I'd say almost none, because in the U.S., as we know, it's the number one bipartisan issue. In fact, probably the only bipartisan issue is the feeling that the U.S. needs to restrict trade and increase competition with China. Ukraine, I don't think had that big of an impact. It'd be interesting to see how policy gets shaped going forward, because there are fractions within the Republican Party about how much one should support Ukraine. Some say we should, stop passing the money. We need to spend that money at home. Others would say Russia, since the beginning of the Cold War, has been a geopolitical enemy. How could we ever just let them take it? That would be a foreign policy disaster akin to withdrawing from Afghanistan, right? So there's fractions there, but I don't think that really came into play. I do think the issue in Gaza was more significant. What was interesting, though, is if you look at the Michigan vote. So Michigan, Dearborn, Michigan, has a lot of, I think 200,000 or so Arab American voters, and they went Republican. So that's an interesting statistic. So I think there's at play the issue of, are you voting because you're unhappy with how the Biden administration has prosecuted the war? Are you also voting your pocket because you're working for a union? How do these things? There's multiple layers per voter is, I guess, what I would take away from that.
Right. Now, Angela, it was not just a presidential election. We had elections on the Senate, on the House, a whole bunch of local legislative bodies. Was this a national election and Trump just pulls everything red?
I don't think so. I think clearly there was, when you go to the polls, you vote president and you usually vote down ballot. But I do think that there was a shift in the mentality of the electorate. But you did see some winners. If you look at Alyssa Slotkin, who's actually a friend of mine. So Alyssa Slotkin is a Democrat. She was a congresswoman in Michigan running for a Senate seat, highly contested. She won it by a hair. I think she won by like 5,000 votes or something. So what I take from that is, indeed, there's been a shift in the electorate and what the values are potentially in the states and what people really worried about their jobs and inflation. But if you look at a candidate like Alyssa, she's out every day, all day, doing the policy work. So the user experience of her is very different from maybe some politicians who, quote data. And the famous criticism of the Democratic Party is, I don't want, you tell us about how the statistics are looking good in a certain place, but our lived experience is different, right? So I think in some, I'd say he did pull the voting rightward, but it was going there anyway. And, if you go anywhere outside the urban cities, you could kind of feel things were changing.
Oh, no, I certainly felt that. I was in the U.S. 2 weeks ago, and I wrote to my team while I was there. I think I asked about 50 people between San Francisco, D.C., and New York, and 46 told me that Trump was going to win. I really was hoping that they were wrong, but of course they knew better. House, is it going to go red as well?
It's probably going to go red. So I was just checking right before we started this morning. It's still not called. We've still got something like, I think 28 seats to 27 seats they still have to call, but the Democrats would have to win 21 of those. So from a trend perspective, that's not going to happen. I mean, the statistic that I took away from the election morning, I was heading in to do an interview early in the morning, and I heard on the radio that Georgia, which is a big swing state, 30% of that electorate is independent. And when Biden and Trump ran last time, it was +8 for Biden. This time it was trending +11 for Trump. So to me, I thought, okay, well, that's it. So again, I think there's underlying trends there to look at. But with the House, for sure it'll go Republican, so we'll have a clean sweep on the Republican side.
So economic issues mattered a lot. Democracy in danger was a theme. But the fact that Trump is a convicted felon, the fact that, he was impeached, or all the other, not so pleasant things that he says, had not much of an impact. I mean, he's getting the popular vote as well.
He is getting the popular vote. So a couple things I'd say to unpick that, because that's definitely, I think, the big takeaway. I'd say a couple things. Number one, interestingly, voter turnout is down. So it was 68% last time. It's a shameful it's not higher. 64% this time. People are saying, oh, Kamala got, 11 million less votes than Biden did. But she got 3 or 4 more than Hillary, right? So there's a lot of kind of data within there. But I think, in some I'd say we're seeing the electorate shift. I don't know that it's values so much that are shifting, again, as people's just pain in the pocket. I mean, it's interesting listening to your optimistic presentation about the states, because I'm now watching, I hate to be the person that says that election's over, let's turn to the next one the same day. But I do think it's interesting to watch what'll happen with the midterms. Because if you look at from the policymaking perspective now, Republicans have everything. So it's like, okay, you wanted it, you have it, let's see what you do. And I don't think we have a Trump now that's coming into power furious. We don't have a Trump that's coming into power wanting to break a lot of things because he just barely got there and he had to, rally the troops to get there. He is kind of an open field. He's quite jubilant is the words that we're hearing described. So what does that policymaking look like in that regard? And then what's the impact of that? What are the outcomes as we go into the next couple of years?
Are you trying to suggest that we will see no daily tweet storm and it won't be that?
No, I'm trying to be optimistic. I think it's going to be very, very, very chaotic. Also because you remember his advisors last time were more establishment people, and now that's not going to be the case. We don't know really exactly who's going to come in. I think it's going to be volatile. But what I take from it, which is interesting, is imagine if he had run a bit more of a conventional campaign, which he was doing until the end, towards the end, when he started making comments about Kamala, and he had the comic on stage that said the racist things about Puerto Rico, which we heard him say maybe he did that because he thought things were too kind of stale. But if he had run a more conventional campaign, and if he dialed down that rhetoric, imagine the gap that it would have been, right? And Kamala had record-breaking money, record-breaking get out the vote efforts, very, very professional and organized, best we've ever seen. And we still had this shift. So imagine if she hadn't been quite so organized and he had been a little calmer. It tells me the electorate has shifted, but then it starts looking at, to me, it becomes shifting to what in terms of policy and what's actually fixable and what's not. But it will definitely, I think, be more volatile from a domestic side and a foreign policy side. Where do the Democrats go from here? I think what I'd like to see is a real step back and forget about party politics and whatnot. This is, of course, ideal. I don't know that they're going to do this. But ideally, I think what they should do is take a step back and say, where is the U.S. voter now? Get it back in touch with them. And you can have a conversation about policy, do things that are closer to, supporting the unions and the working class, which actually, to be fair, I think Biden did. But that feels like things on paper. I think what they need to do is have the connection with a broader voter base and understand some of the cultural issues a bit better and really tap into that a bit better. The message absolutely, as we saw, fell flat. What I am seeing, unfortunately, at least in these first day or so, is a lot of, you did it, no, you did it, no, you did it. We're blaming Biden, we're blaming his wife, we're blaming Kamala, we're blaming her advisors, when actually, to me, it's too big of a gap to be a flaw in the actual campaign prosecution or even the candidate. I just think the values have shifted. The issues that matter to voters are different than they thought they were. Immigration, tax cut, tariffs, all on the cards? All on the cards. I think we're getting a lot. So we work for 80% of the Fortune 500. We've, as you can imagine, been getting heaps of calls around, oh my gosh, what do we do? In fact, we've been scenario planning for months for both sides. I think the thing to look at is, so number one, I think what he'll do is what he did last time, which is he has a day one package that'll probably include an executive order that says freeze everything until we review it. That's fair. We may see some things around immigration on day one, like, we saw some quite striking things before. But I do still think it's early days. There's a lot of jockey. So first of all, they don't know, even with the Senate, how big that majority is going to be. There's still some Senate races to call. So the question, once we have all the numbers around the races, we'll understand how big is your Senate majority, how big is your House majority. They're starting to think about who's going to be the Senate majority leader. Mitch McConnell's retiring. Was reading this morning, there's a kind of a jockeying between the three people that should have that and are close to Trump and want that. Who is that? And who starts getting on those really powerful House committees like the Appropriations Committee, the Ways and Means Committee. So it really matters, I think, not just who he's putting in his cabinet and as advisors, but how the workings of government shape up. And I've done a bit of dusting off of education around how does the law actually work. So if you look at something like NATO, there's been legislation passed recently, last December, to more formalize the U.S. Interaction with or belonging to NATO. So you can't just walk in and do an executive order and rip it up, so to speak. It's different for Ukraine. There's funding that we give, but the Americans give, but that can be stopped. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what the workings of government actually allow in a situation where you have a completely dominant party and what they don't, because it's going to be different. They put some things in place to stop, to reduce the ability for one person to come in and change everything overnight. It's going to take some time to figure out. But speaking of one person, Elon Musk is pretty popular and powerful. Popular, I don't know, I meant powerful. He went all in with Trump. He did. And it worked out for him. In the past, Angela, the Republican Party has been the party of big corporations. We see a bit of a bifurcation now. We see some tech bros, Elon Musk, the Winklevoss brothers, Peter Thiel, they have been big funders of Trump. But the rest of the corporate world still seems to be either mainstream Republican or Democrat. So is the Republican Party a party of big corporations no more? Well, it's interesting that you say that. I think that was also my impression. But in recent days and weeks, as we've been going out and talking to clients, there are quite a lot of big corporations that are more supportive of that America First agenda than you might see, especially, kind of looking at it from over here. So I think it's a bit of a mix. What I'm watching for, and you're the economist and a lot of really smart people watching finance in this room, I'm really watching for, okay, he's got the stage now. He's got everything. He has nothing to prove in terms of the election. He won it by a large margin. He's a lame duck president, no more elections to be had. So he can kind of rest for a second and say, what do I actually want to accomplish? He does have an agenda. It's called Agenda 47. It's 14 pages. It's not long. So there's not a lot of policy detail there. But what's he going to actually do? And at some point, does he take the ear more of the more bombastic advisors he's had before on trade and economic policy, or does he start talking to more traditional economists that are, we've seen the statistics that say if everything he said he wanted to do, the high tariffs went into place, very damaging for the U.S. economy, very damaging for the global economy. Is he going to actually do it? I mean, let's see if he gets some advisors around him that can maybe help him moderate some of that policy. So in some, I'd say the Republican Party still is supporting, representing big business, but even something like the Business Leaders Roundtable has come out and said they're, have big concerns. So in some, I'd say it's a mix, but it's not just he's got the tech and the crypto people and none of big business. It's really overlapped.
Could he, under a scenario that you can think of, and maybe you can assign a probability to that, step down in 2 years and give the presidency to J.D. Vance?
So that's an interesting proposition. I think overall, I'd say that's unlikely. But remember, he's not a young man.
He'll be 80 in 2 years' time.
Yeah. And actually, what's interesting is one of the top risks that we're trending as control risks in the years ahead is if you look at, first of all, as we know, this was the year of the election globally. If you take a step back a second, year of the election globally, almost all of those from Japan and India to France and the UK change elections. So what we're seeing in the States is actually not that different. Also, if you look at the countries with the 10 biggest populations, almost all of them have leaders that are well north of 75. Russia, you can kind of name them all off. So does he step down in 2 years? What's his health like? What's his mental ability like? I mean, one thing is stepping down, another might be just to step kind of a little bit back like Reagan did. I don't know that he'd be keen to relinquish it, but also I don't think he's that keen to govern. He was keen to prove a point and get in. He feels passionate about tariffs. He feels passionate about China. And he feels, I think, passionate about, domestic policy that might push back a vengeance, as they say, right, on some people that he thought blocked him before. I don't think this isn't a Joe Biden or Bill Clinton that's like, I just want to get into that policy and really tweak what we're actually doing from a legislative point of view. So there's a scenario, he gets tired and or bored or unhealthy, but I think it would take a lot for him to formally step down. But I could see him stepping back and then others would jump in. But I would say on J.D. Vance, doesn't have a lot of friends. Right? I mean, there was a phenomenal podcast David Remnick from The New Yorker did with Newt Gingrich, who, if you remember, was the Republican from way back who first orchestrated, the Tea Party and what became the MAGA movement. And it is scathing things to say about J.D. Vance and how young he is and how much his policy positions have shifted just with the wind. So I think there's a long list of people right around J.D. Vance that if there's an opening, he wouldn't step down. But in terms of having power, I don't know that it's going to go straight to him.
All right, let's talk about China. It's not the case that Donald Trump brought in the entire anti-China spectrum. The U.S. had been turning sort of protectionist even during the Obama years, but he turbocharged it with the tariffs. But it's not like, Biden took anything back. In fact, in the last 4 years, it's gotten tighter on China, on tech access, and no tariffs have come down. What can we expect, and what are you telling your clients on the China policy?
Yeah, so I think we shouldn't be too worried out of the gate. I can see that there's a thinking of being very, very worried. He said really aggressive things, 60% tariffs and whatnot. But I think the way he's coming in matters. He's not coming in with something to prove. That may impact who he's bringing in, which then impacts policy. I still think we're going to see some of the same old faces, Robert Lighthizer, maybe Peter Navarro as an advisor in some way. And definitely what we're advising clients is the U.S.-China tensions will continue and probably escalate in the trade area. But he's also, if you want to be optimistic, I mean, he is a deal maker, and so is Xi Jinping. So there is a scenario where they kind of look at what is on offer and figure out some ways to focus very specifically on things. I mean, the Biden administration with Jake Sullivan had the approach with China of, as you know, narrow yard, high fence. Trump is more blunt policy tools, 60% tariffs and everything. I don't know what he's going to actually do, though, in the end. I think we have to see. I will say on the China side, they've not retaliated in kind. They've done bits, but it has never equal to nor exceeded what the U.S. has done in terms of trade restrictions. So I would say two things. Number one, China has put together the architecture to retaliate quite well in these past years. Unreliable entities list, anti-foreign sanctions law. So they have it there. They haven't really used it. But then I would say, let's look at third countries. Because if you've got, if the U.S. really were to want to tighten trade restrictions with China, you're asking Japan and the Netherlands and others to stop exporting their semiconductor manufacturing equipment. But even Biden couldn't get that to happen. At some point, allies say, there's only so far we can help you. What does that look like if you have a more bombastic, unilateralist president? Biden will probably, I don't know that Trump's going to have as strong relationships with the countries he's trying to keep on side as Biden would do.
Korea, Japan, Taiwan, these countries are also looking at this election with some degree of nervousness.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. Obviously, number one, there's trade. There's trade and there's security, the trade economics and security. From the trade and economics perspective, we hear a lot, of course, about actual trade flows and whatnot. But look also at the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act in the States that was giving, that legislation that Biden put in was giving a lot of credits to companies in Korea, Taiwan, and Japan to put investments of, tech manufacturing equipment in, especially in, kind of southern states. So what happens to that IRA? That's going to be interesting. Trump has said, I'm going to rip all those things up, which would make white elephants out of these investments in the states. But what if they're in red states? Maybe that's not such a good idea. They're bringing jobs to the states. So there's this very interesting trade investment component. I did see last night on TV that Japan thinks by the end of the year now, it's going to be able to take the acquisition of U.S. steel, which was a big question, right? Because how can the U.S. ask Japan to help them so much on trade when they're pushing them and saying, but you can't invest in U.S. steel? That's been a tricky one. But then obviously I'd say the security component, right? So the U.S., of course, has been providing security support to Korea and Japan. Under Trump 1.0, he was asking for or pressing for more payment to be made by Japan and Korea, increase your own defense spending, take on this burden yourself. Where does that go? Out of the gate, one could say that's going to be back on the table. But again, maybe it's not because it's a different world. And there's, I guess in some, I'd say I'm watching to see if his approach now, if it's a learned approach, that you can't ask for a trade something on this side and then push someone hard on security for this side. It's a complex, it's a multi, phrase sentence, so to speak. And what do his advisors say on that? What does he do?
Okay. Finally,
yeah.
Singapore. We do such a good job of balancing East and the West under Trump. 2.0.
I think we keep balancing. I mean, first of all, I'd say Singapore has done a phenomenal job. It's not easy. I think it's going to continue to not be easy. I think there's looking at the signal through the noise. I think there'll be a lot of volatility, tweets coming through or X coming through. But when you look at the actual policy, I don't think the U.S. is looking to change anything radically as it relates to Singapore or even Southeast Asia. Some of the tensions that we see potentially spiking are things around Vietnam or Malaysia that have big trade deficits with the U.S. And what does that mean also for China to invest in a third country to then export to the States? Is that fair? What does the U.S. think about that? That's, I think, the interest with Southeast Asia. I think Singapore continues to balance well. There is a scenario where U.S.-China tensions don't necessarily get all that much worse. And Singapore, keep on keeping on, I would say. And it has a great, obviously, team in place to do that.
Angela, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Kopi Time was produced by Ken Delbridge from Splice Studios. Violet Lee and Daisy Sherwood provided additional assistance. This podcast is for information only and does not provide any trade recommendations. All 140 episodes of Kopi Time are available on YouTube. as well as on all major podcast platforms, including Apple and Spotify. As for our research publications and webinars, you can find them all by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.